Good morning, students. We'll start with our BMS chapter 4, that is IT resources today. Now, IT resources chapter has topics open source software, that is OSS, some popular open source software applications. So, there are many applications in this. Operating system, how your operating system works for those softwares. Windows versions which are compatible, then Symbian OS, Palm OS, supporting utilities for these operating systems, screensavers, and this is the chapter of IT resources chapter. Then first we'll be going with open source software. So what is open source? So when we talk about open source software, the first question which comes under and in the mind, that is, what is open source? So the term open source refers to something people can modify and share because its design is publicly accessible. Yes, if you check in your Google, if you go on Google Chrome and if you check a website, there is a symbol up there which shows that it's a public. If it is a circular symbol, it will define as public. If it is a particular different symbol than your circle, then that can be a private website. Means what? If it is public, it can be accessible with everybody, anyone can access it. If it is private, certain people who are authenticated or authorized with that website only can access those websites. Such private websites also have passwords and logins, so that is the reason that is called as private. So open source software is such software. Or what is open source actually? We'll not move on to open source software first. We'll just check what is open source. Open source means somebody can download it, somebody can make changes into it, and somebody can share it as it is publicly accessible. So, the term originated in the context of software development to designate a specific approach to creating computer programs. So, this was actually an approach so that people can make computer programs. So, this context of open source was in the software development cycle and which was being created for developing computer programs. So today, however, open source designates a broader set of values, what we call the open source way. So there are n number of values nowadays in open source. So and people personally prefer open source so that it is very easy and accessible anytime. Open source projects, products, or initiatives embrace and celebrate principles of open exchange, collaborative participation, rapid prototyping, transparency, meritocracy, and community oriented development. So, these are the actual functions on which your open source works. Means what? Open source can help you in open source projects, people using game development engines, then your normal web applications, that is your shopping websites, all those are open source projects. Then initiative embrace and celebrate principles of open exchange policy, people sharing same virtual uh, applications for people access. Then collaborative participations, nowadays there are companies who collaborate together on one particular business organization. Rapid prototyping, you can access one code image, that is code of one application to another application, same graphical user also you can create. Transparency is there is no certain security level, there is maximum actually defined security on the interface only. Then community oriented development, people require and then they develop it, is a community oriented development for open source. Now, the next question which comes in mind is what is open source software? So, we heard what is open source. Now, we'll see what is open source software. Open source software is a software with source code that anyone can inspect, that anyone can check. Inspect means checking. Modify, they can make the changes, and they can enhance, means they can use it anywhere or they can save those changes as well. Source code is a part of software that most computer users don't ever see. So computer users are not concerned with the source code, but still source code is what actually your software is working on. That is the code, actual code on which your software runs. So that is basically source code. It's the code computer programmers can manipulate. Computer programmers use the source code to develop the software, change how a piece of software, a program or application works. So this is what is the development of the software depend on the source code. So next is programmers have to access to computer program source code can improve the program by adding features or fixing parts that they don't always work correctly. So source code will help the programmers to change the software difficulties or issues or make any new feature adding up into it. So that can be termed as an open source software. So with this software there are many questions and many misassumptions which are there. So there are four main misassumptions. So we'll be going one by one with those misassumptions. The first one is, what's the difference between open source software and other types of software? So the first question which is there is, what's the difference between open source software and other types of software? The solution for this is, or the answer for this is, some software has source code that only the person, team or organization who created it maintains exclusively control over it can modify. People call this kind of software proprietary or a closed source software. Now some softwares which are only created for certain users on which certain teams are working, and those access is only done and maintained by organization and the control is totally modified by the organization. Such people or such kind of software can be called as proprietary or closed source, that is closed source software. Nobody else, public, cannot access it. That is called as closed source. Only the original authors of proprietary software can legally copy, inspect and alter that software. The proprietary means the actual handing over of that software. Handler is there who is doing the software, can only copy, check and alter the data of the software. And in order to use proprietary software, computer users must agree assigning a license displayed the first time they run this software. Yes, nowadays even if you run any application which is private, which requires an authenticated user, they give you terms and policies on which you click I agree and then you further check that application. Such softwares are closed source software. You cannot check their source codes. And now open source software is different. Now when you talk about closed source, certain limitations are there. When you talk about open source, its authors make its sources code available to others. Now this open source software authority is given to everybody and their code can be viewed, copy and learn and altered and shared by anybody over the person accessing it. Then there are LibreOffice and GNU image manipulation program for examples of open source. So there are certain application examples of one is LibreOffice and GNU image manipulation program are examples of open source softwares. As they do with proprietary softwares, user must accept the terms of license when they use the open source. So here also I accept condition is there in the open source as well, but legal terms of open source license differ dramatically from those of the proprietary license. So that I accept condition of closed source and I accept terms and conditions of open source will be somewhere different. As well as open source licenses affect the way people can use, study, modify and distribute the software. Open source software's license does not affect the way, so people can use it, share it, they can copy the data, they can use the software anywhere, or they can suggest the software to somebody else, they can modify in that software and make their own softwares. So this is called as open source. So in general, open source license grant computer users permission to use open source software for any purpose they wish. So indirectly, the open source software is giving people and right to access the software and make the changes according to their wish. Then by design, Open source software license promote collaboration and sharing because they permit other people to make modifications to the source code and incorporate those changes into their own projects. So they allow them to make the changes, they allow them to collaborate with some other software, they invite those software changes in their own software also. So this is the difference between your open source software and a other different type of software. So what we conclude here is open source software is available by everybody, it is publicly accessible, the license terms are different, but other types of software can be called as closed source software. That means closed source means their accessibility is termed till the proprietary concerns of that person making the software. Second question which arises is open source software only important to computer programmers? So the question answer is no. Open source technology and open source thinking both benefit programmers and non-programmers. As everybody can access it, the use is only not till the programmers. Non-programmers, that is the normal users, also have the benefit because early inventors built much of the internet itself on the open source technologies like Linux operating system and Apache web server applications. Anyone using the internet today benefits from open source software. So the benefit should be got by all is the actual feature of open source software, and that is the reason open source is used by everybody and it benefits everybody, that is the programmer who has created and the non-programmer who is working or using that software. Every time computer users view web pages, check email, chat with friends, stream music online, or play multiplayer video games, their computers, mobile phones, or gaming consoles connect to a global network of computers using open source software to route and transmit their data to the local devices they have in front of them. So, what functions you can do with open sources? You can use web pages, that is web applications. You can check your emails, you can chat with the friends with different applications, you can stream music online, that is you can listen music online, then you can play multimedia player video, you can use video playing options, you can play games, you can use computers over those software. Then mobile phones, you can run those softwares on your mobile phones. You can use gaming consoles to connect to global network. Nowadays you play online games also. This everything is routed with open source software, so that open source software could transmit their local device data in front of them. So connectivity can be a concern for open source. Then more and more people rely on remote computers when performing tasks. Nowadays people are very much into smartphones or remotely access devices. So wherever they go they can use those devices, and for which open source can be an option. Some people call remote computing as cloud computing because it involves activities like storing files, sharing photos, and watching videos that incorporate not only local devices but also global network of remote computers that form an atmosphere around them. So nowadays people, for this open source, people have other option also, that is called as cloud computing, through which they can access, share and upload the data overall, for which you have n number of applications, that is Google Apps, and then Own Cloud, Nextcloud, open source. These are all open source on which you can upload your data. Then third question which arises is, why do people prefer using open source software? So what is the actual reason why people are using open source? So there are four concerns in which open source is used. First one is control. Many people prefer source software because they may have more control over the kind of software, so they can do any changes into it, and for that reason they can use those software. Training, they do not require training like other software license agreements, and that is the reason they prefer the open source. Then the next is security. Some people prefer open source software because they consider it more secure and stable than proprietary software. Rather, going the data on the proprietary business organization's database, we can use and just leave the data from the history, can be one source and of security for maintaining the user's data. Then the next is stability. Stability is many users prefer open source software because proprietary software for more important long term projects. So proprietary softwares are for long term project, that is the closed source software. Because programmers publicly distribute the source code for open source software, users relying on that software for critical tasks can ensure their tools won't disappear or fall into disrepair if their original creators stop working using them. So if somebody else has developed a project or a software in proprietary business, that is closed source, if they are not using it, they can remove it and nobody else can use it afterwards. But it is not the same in open source. Even if open source creator software tools we are using and it has been developed by somebody else, and still that person closes its source, the open source which we have downloaded those tools, we can use it further even if the original creator gets despair. So this is one thing of stability, that their data remains there only. The fourth question which arises in the people's mind is, doesn't open source just mean something is free of charge? So no, it's just not free of charge. No, this is a common misconception about the open source implies. The concept implications are not only economic. This is just not as economy, just related to money. Open source means not free of charge. Open source software programmers can charge money for the open source software they create or to which they contribute. But in some cases, because an open source license might require them to release their source code, when they sell software to others, some programmers find that charging users money for software services and support. So sometimes when you download these tools for open sourcing, you need to give money if they change the software owner in case of the services what you are providing on the basis of government rules and regulations. Then it's not, software remains free of charge, but they make money helping others to install and use. Yes, nowadays if you know that reasons or not, sometimes we get that refer this application to 5 people and earn 50 rupees. These are the things what are coming into trend. So with this, what they do is, by installation they use the proprietary concerns, and then because of 100 people installing, they get 100 rupees a day, or in terms of dollars. So for because of which they get the money constraints, and that is the reason they help us to free download the softwares, which can be one benefit for money concerns. Then the next is some popular open source software applications. So there are many applications. Today we'll be going with first 5, that is WordPress. WordPress is the most world's popular blogging platform, used by staggering 202 million websites. So WordPress is a open source software which is used by 202 million websites for accessing their code. As simple or as complex as you want it to be. You can use it as simple as you can make it more complex as you can. WordPress is supported by a wide array of plugins. You have just plugins, that is the tools. You can use those tools anywhere, wherever you want. Besides blogs, people just create blogs using those WordPress. But not only by blogs, they can be used as a straightforward content management system. People can use those as a content management system for their online shops. WordPress is a e-commerce theme online magazine. Using WordPress, you can create online shop, e-commerce business also. Photographers and designers also use WordPress for creation of online portfolios. Next is Magento. Magento is used by 30,000 merchants, including Samsung, Nespresso, and the North Face, in the world's fastest growing commerce platform. So for e-commerce, Magento is the next one with 30,000 merchants using it. It has an open source license, open source software license. The enterprise edition, which you have to pay other features like multi-store capabilities. When you want to create a multi-store capability, that time you have to pay some amount, but store credits, gift cards, out of the box limits, all those things are preferred by Magento. The next one is Mozilla Firefox. Obviously, Mozilla Firefox, you might be knowing, it's a browser which is used by n number of people for browsing. If you do not prefer Chrome, you prefer Firefox browser. It's a web browser and the application is used by everybody. It's free of cost. You can go and check the source coding also for the development. Next is Mozilla Thunderbird. With its speedy searches, built-in RSS feeds, strong security and superb add-ons, Thunderbird has the best free email application available. And here, like Chrome has Gmail, it has email application available, Thunderbird, Mozilla Thunderbird, and it's very faster in speed, and it has different add-ons, that is functionalities for working, and it's absolutely very good to work around and probably not ideal for complete no voices. So it's not ideal for people working into certain constraint structure. It can be just in a faster speed. Who want to complete their task faster can move on with Mozilla Thunderbird. Next is FileZilla. FileZilla is a hugely successful cross-platform FTP client. FileZilla is, as the word says, file. FileZilla works with FTP, that is File Transfer Protocol client. It's also available as a server. It can separately work as a server for Windows also. Then in FileZilla, you can maintain file records, file data, and file authority, file access authorities also. Creation of files, saving of files, manipulation of file data can be done through FileZilla. So I have these graphical interfaces also. Tomorrow I'll be showing you the graphic interface of this open source software as well. And there are many more softwares like this in the open source applications, which we'll be seeing in the next lecture. Thank you.